So, when we are considering that theology is words about God, and that the sources of theology are scriptures, tradition, and human experience, then it is good for us to talk about what is revelation. The word revelation, similar to the word theology, is most easily understood when you break it down etymologically into its ancient roots. And the ancient roots for the word revelation are the words re, R-E, plus velum, V-E-L-L-U-M. What this literally translates into is the removal of a veil, a re velum, just like revocare, revoke, is to try to unspeak something or take it back. So, if we understand that imagery, I think that gives us a unique insight into what is intended to be communicated when people talk about revelation. What they're talking about is any means by which God somehow self-discloses, by which God somehow communicates with human persons who God is. And there's a very difficult distinction to be made when we're talking about that between different types of revelation, because we can talk about revelation as being immediate or revelation as being mediate or mediated. Now, immediate revelation consists of the notion that God somehow can speak directly to people, that God can take God's own ideas and God's own divine mind and somehow implant them into the human mind in their fullness. Most people don't believe that this is actually in fact possible, because in fact what we get is that God may speak to people, may speak to their hearts, let us say, and yet there is always an act of interpretation. The very language that is being used itself conditions what is understood. And so this can get a little philosophically dense, and we'll explore this a little bit further. But I want right now at least to introduce this distinction to you because I think it's helpful to begin to think about that, to begin to think about the fact that if we're talking about words about God coming from scriptures, tradition, and human experience, what we're talking about are messages that come through various cultures and times and places where people have different ideas of themselves and their goals and their communities. And so they may have an encounter with the mysterious God, and they try to put a language to that. As you can see in the final bullet point, this can occur naturally, kind of gradually through the natural order, or historically, specifically to groups of people. So, for example, during the first part of the course, we'll be looking at the Hebrew scriptures and the stories of people who believed that God was leading them, that God was leading them to freedom, God was leading them to the fulfillment of a promise. And so a peoples over many, many generations encountered God, and they sought to put that into their stories, which ultimately became what we call the Old Testament, these texts. And again, their language is very important to consider, their times, their circumstances, their cultures, their priorities, in terms of how they basically grappled with the mystery of who is God.